Aging isn't a moment. It's a process, a quiet, slow, and haunting journey. Some people welcome old age like a long-awaited reward, a time to rest. Relax, let go of work, responsibilities, and noise, but others arrive and find themselves stunned, asking, "Why do I feel so empty?" Old age isn't always as gentle as people imagine. It comes with questions that no one answers. It's the moment you face a home that once felt cozy but now feels too big, when your children have moved far away, when your wedding photo sits silently beside your bed, when the sound of motorbikes in the alley no longer makes your heart race. It's when you walk into a supermarket and realize that everyone moves faster than you, thinks quicker than you, and no one really notices you standing there. One day I sat with a woman named Margaret, 89 years old, living in a nursing home just outside Seattle. I asked her a very simple question. "What are you thinking about right now?" She answered, "I'm waiting." I asked, "Waiting for what?" She said, "I'm not really sure, maybe a phone call, a visit, or maybe just waiting for the moment to close my eyes." That answer stayed with me for months. Not because it was sad, but because it was true. So I started asking more elders the same question. In nursing homes, at community gatherings, in parks, churches, marketplaces, gentle silver-haired men and women with trembling hands and eyes that no longer sparkled but still glowed with honesty, they all whispered the same kinds of worries. Never shouting, never complaining, just quiet truths. But enough to help me realize old age is not something to be pitied, it's something that needs to be heard. So I gathered those stories. I distilled them. I saw my own parents and grandparents reflected in them. And now I'm telling them to you, not to scare you, but to prepare you. And if you are already growing old, then to remind you, you are not alone. The first fear almost everyone mentioned was forgetfulness. Not just being forgotten, but forgetting who you are. It doesn't come suddenly. It creeps in quietly. One day you forget your glasses, the next you forget your grandchild's name. Then one day you can't remember the way home, even though you've walked that street for 30 years. Some describe it as a fog. Others say, "I know the name, it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't pull it out." Forgetfulness doesn't just scare you, it shames you. You sit at a family dinner feeling like a stranger. You can't keep up with the conversation. You're afraid to ask again. You force a smile, then you fall silent. I remember Mr. Paul, a former university professor, 75 years old. He once taught thousands of students. Now he can't remember their names. He can't get through 3 pages of a book without forgetting how it started. He said, "The hardest part isn't forgetting them, it's seeing them look at me like I'm no longer me." Memory loss doesn't just take away your past, it takes away your sense of self. But then I saw Mr. Paul start painting. With his left hand, even though he was right-handed. He used children's apps to learn Spanish. He did puzzles with his grandson. Every morning he wrote down 3 things he remembered from the day before, and every night he read them again. Not to test himself, but to connect, to tell his brain, "I'm still here." Aging isn't a moment. It's a process, a quiet, slow, and haunting journey. Some people welcome old age like a long-awaited reward, a time to rest, relax, let go of work, responsibilities, and noise. But others arrive and find themselves stunned, asking, "Why do I feel so empty?" Old age isn't always as gentle as people imagine. It comes with questions that no one answers. It's the moment you face a home that once felt cozy but now feels too big. When your children have moved far away, when your wedding photo sits silently beside your bed, when the sound of motorbikes in the alley no longer makes your heart race. It's when you walk into a supermarket and realize that everyone moves faster than you, thinks quicker than you, and no one really notices you standing there. One day I sat with a woman named Margaret, 89 years old, living in a nursing home just outside Seattle. I asked her a very simple question. "What are you thinking about right now?" She answered, "I'm waiting." I asked, "Waiting for what?" She said, "I'm not really sure, maybe a phone call, a visit, or maybe just waiting for the moment to close my eyes." That answer stayed with me for months, not because it was sad, but because it was true. So I started asking more elders the same question, in nursing homes, at community gatherings, in parks, churches, marketplaces. Gentle silver-haired men and women with trembling hands and eyes that no longer sparkled but still glowed with honesty, they all whispered the same kinds of worries, never shouting, never complaining, just quiet truths, but enough to help me realize old age is not something to be pitied, it's something that needs to be heard. So I gathered those stories. I distilled them. I saw my own parents and grandparents reflected in them. And now I'm telling them to you, not to scare you, but to prepare you. And if you are already growing old, then to remind you, you are not alone. The first fear almost everyone mentioned was forgetfulness. Not just being forgotten, but forgetting who you are. It doesn't come suddenly. It creeps in quietly. One day you forget your glasses, the next you forget your grandchild's name. Then one day you can't remember the way home even though you've walked that street for 30 years. Some describe it as a fog. Others say, "I know the name, it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't pull it out." Forgetfulness doesn't just scare you, it shames you. You sit at a family dinner feeling like a stranger. You can't keep up with the conversation. You're afraid to ask again. You force a smile. Then you fall silent. I remember Mr. Paul, a former university professor, 75 years old. He once taught thousands of students. Now he can't remember their names. He can't get through 3 pages of a book without forgetting how it started. He said the hardest part isn't forgetting them, it's seeing them look at me like I'm no longer me. Memory loss doesn't just take away your past, it takes away your sense of self. But then I saw Mr. Paul start painting with his left hand even though he was right-handed. He used children's apps to learn Spanish. He did puzzles with his grandson. Every morning he wrote down 3 things he remembered from the day before, and every night he read them again. Not to test himself, but to connect, to tell his brain, I'm still here. Scientists have proven that the brain can form new connections even at age 80. Memory is like a muscle, and a muscle that isn't exercised will shrink. But if you keep it alive with curiosity, with playfulness, with learning, with connection, you may not be able to stop time, but you can stretch yourself further into the memory that remains. Old age is not a destination. It's a journey, one we are all on, whether fast or slow, whether intentional or swept along. And then one day you open your eyes and realize the things that once felt certain now feel fragile. The people who were always by your side are now fewer. The memories that once shone bright as the midday sun now drift like morning mist. Old age does not knock on your door. It arrives in the crackle of joints each morning, in the hurried glances of grandchildren, in the long hallway lights of a nursing home, and sometimes in the silence so deep you can hear the ticking of a clock. I used to think I understood old age until I sat next to my grandfather in his final days. He was once an engineer who taught me how to hammer nails, ride a bicycle, and said, "Being a man means keeping your word." But now he could no longer remember my name. The name he had called out hundreds of times had turned to confusion. He looked at me for a long time, smiled gently, but said nothing. I smiled back, but inside my heart fell into a hollow space. And from that moment, I began a journey to understand what truly happens inside the minds and hearts of the elderly, not through theory, but through life. Through long conversations with former doctors, retired ballet dancers, or motorbike mechanics who had never left their small hometowns. I collected the worries they had never shared with their children. I listened to whispers they only dared speak at midnight after the hallway lights had dimmed, when everyone thought they were asleep. And I discovered there are 5 fears that seem to haunt almost every elderly person. Regardless of background, religion, culture, or education, they all face the same 5 storms. Some speak of them, some remain silent, some endure them alone. Others find ways to share. Today I'm sharing these with you, not so you'll pity the elderly, but so you can understand them. And if you are walking this path yourself, consider this my letter to you as a companion, not a preacher. Someone simply sitting beside you and saying, I'm on this road too. The first fear, and perhaps the most common, is the fear of memory. But it's not just the fear of forgetting what you ate or where you left your glasses. It's the fear of losing yourself. A 78-year-old woman once told me, I'm not afraid of illness. I'm afraid of waking up one day and no longer knowing who I am. Not remembering the name of the child I gave birth to and raised. Not remembering my wedding day. Not remembering the song my husband used to play. Each memory is a brick in the house of self. And when those bricks start to crumble, we feel like the whole structure is collapsing bit by bit, day by day, and we can't stop it. I've met many people in the early stages of Alzheimer's. They still talk, they still laugh, they still tell stories. But there are gaps, names they can't recall, places that once felt familiar now seem distant. The pain isn't when others remind you. It's when you realize yourself that you've forgotten. That confusion, that quiet anger, that unspoken helplessness, it doesn't weigh on the brain, it weighs on the heart. But I also met people who refused to let that fear define them. Mr. Daniel, 80 years old, a former accountant, does Sudoku every day and studies Italian. He isn't learning it to visit Italy. He learns to keep his mind alive. I don't need to remember everything he said, smiling. I just need to feel like I'm still learning, still living. And that smile, I believe, is the best medicine for his brain. The second fear is the fear of loneliness, not loneliness because there's no one around, but because there's no one who needs you anymore. There's a big difference between being alone and being left behind. I once sat in the room of Ms. Helen, 91 years old, who lived alone with over 300 books, 2 cats, and an old radio. She told me I'm used to it, but being used to it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Her son lived in another state, calling once a week. They didn't argue, but they also didn't have much to say. Life kept moving forward and she felt left behind. Not bitter, but without much hope either. Elderly loneliness isn't a gap in the calendar, it's a gap in the heart. It's when they cook a favorite dish, but no one compliments it. When they remember someone's birthday, but no one remembers theirs. When they sit in front of the TV just to hear voices, not for the content, but because sound feels better than silence. Then I met Mr. Larry, 87, who lives in a nursing home but video calls 3 old friends every morning on Zoom. They don't talk about deep things, they just reminisce, complain about politics, and laugh at each other's silly mistakes. But he said, I still feel like I'm part of something. Connection doesn't have to be big, it just has to be real. Once I asked an elderly man if he felt sad when his loved ones drifted away or grew distant. He smiled and said, Son, what good is sadness when there's no one left to be sad with? That line sounded gentle, but to me it was the most honest summary of loneliness in old age. When there's no one left to be sad with, it's not just physical loss, it's emotional collapse. It's hard for someone who used to be the backbone of the family. The voice at the dinner table, the one who made decisions, to now feel like they're no longer needed. No one asks their opinion when the family decides to move to another state. No one asks what they want for dinner because anything is fine as long as it's soft. No one asks how they felt after the doctor's visit, only reading the numbers and saying, you're fine. So they begin to retreat inward like a fading shadow, not because they want to, but because no one brings them into the light anymore. But some elders have found themselves again in that loneliness. Miss Teresa, 85, started a blog. It doesn't have thousands of followers, but she has a loyal group. 12 other seniors across America. They email each other discussing small things: how to replant orchids, how to make stewed potatoes softer for weak teeth, how to write poetry when you can't sleep. I asked her, "Don't you feel sad that only a few people read your blog?" She replied, 12 is better than 0, and at least I know I still have something to say. She replied, 12 is better than 0, and at least I know I still have something to say. Connection doesn't come from the crowd. It comes from sincerity, and old age needs sincerity more than any other stage of life. A heartfelt phone call, a coffee meetup just to listen, a hug that isn't rushed. Loneliness isn't as frightening as the feeling of being invisible. The third fear, and a very real one, is the fear of chronic illness, of gradually losing control over one's body. No one wants to become a burden, but more and more older adults feel like they've become a dead weight in the very homes they once built. They hesitate to ask for help. They feel embarrassed when they can't use the bathroom on their own. They feel insulted when their children repeat things to them as if they were children themselves. Yet they have no other choice. A 78-year-old man once told me, "My biggest fear is being bedridden, needing someone to feed me. I don't want my child to see me like that." So he chose to live alone, even though it's difficult, even though the risk of falling is high. He said, "At least if something happens, it's on me." That line stayed with me all night. It wasn't just bravery. It was a way of holding on to dignity, preserving a bit of autonomy, a bit of freedom, while everything else slips away. I've met older adults who push themselves to exercise every morning, not to be young again, but to slow down the decline. Some practice meditation to lower blood pressure. Some switch to a vegetarian diet after 75 to improve digestion. They don't believe in turning back the clock, but they believe in taking active control within new limits. And that deserves deep respect, Mr. Durr. Joe, 82, told me I can't climb mountains like I used to, but I can still walk around the block. 20 minutes every morning, 20 every evening. It's my way of telling my body I haven't given up. Persistence isn't about defeating old age, it's about cooperating with it. Like dancing, if you can't lead, then learn to move gracefully together. I remember a quote from an elderly Japanese woman: "Old age is when you relearn everything, but slower and with a softer heart." I believe she was right. The body may not be as strong, but you can relearn how to eat, how to breathe, how to live at a new pace, and most importantly, how to live without feeling like a burden. The truth is, most elderly people aren't afraid of dying. They're afraid of living without meaning. They're afraid of living in dependence without respect. And that leads us to the fourth fear, living without purpose. This fear doesn't arrive the day you retire, it comes later. When you realize your days now revolve around 3 meals and a few TV shows that blur together. When the calendar no longer matters because there's nothing left to mark. When there's no one to wake up in the morning, no one who needs your advice, no one who asks what you think about life. I once spoke with Mrs. Ruth, 84, who had been a nurse for 45 years. She had cared for hundreds of people, saved lives, held the hands of the dying, and whispered, "I'm here." But now, sitting in a wheelchair, she told me, "No one needs me anymore. I sit here and feel like a shadow." I asked, "Do you still want to be needed?" She looked at me for a long time and said, "No one asks that anymore." But yes, I do, very much. She looked at me for a long time and said, "No one asks that anymore. But yes, I do, very much." That feeling of meaninglessness is a quiet crack in the soul of the elderly, when they feel they have nothing left to contribute, when no one asks what they think, when no one gives them a role, and worse, sometimes they begin to believe it themselves. But even in that despair, I've met people who rediscovered purpose through the smallest acts. Mr. Henry, 79 years old, cuts a few flowers from his garden every morning and brings them to his neighbor who also lives alone. It's nothing big, he says, but she smiles. And that makes me feel like I did something. Purpose doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be something useful to someone, even if only for a moment. I know an elderly woman named Anna who learned to use a smartphone at 83 just so she could send pictures of her cat to the seniors group chat in her neighborhood. Every time someone replied so cute, she printed the message and taped it to her wall. She smiled and said, "At least I made someone laugh today." You see, meaning doesn't come from doing something big. It comes from being seen, from being heard, from knowing that you can still reach someone even with a word, a hug, or a simple act, and that is enough. But the final fear, the deepest one and perhaps the most avoided, is the fear of death. Not physical death, but the death of the spirit, the death of hope, the death of presence, the kind where you're still breathing but you've stopped living. There was a man named Thomas I'll never forget. He used to be a musician. When I asked him what he feared most, he didn't say dying. He said, "I'm afraid of dying while still alive." I asked, "What do you mean?" He replied, "It's when you still walk, still eat, still smile, but inside the lights have gone out. No more dreams, no more desire. No more feeling that tomorrow is any different from today." That moment I understood the death that the elderly fear most doesn't come from illness. It comes from being spiritually abandoned. We teach each other all kinds of ways to live healthily, to live long, to live rich, but few of us teach how to die peacefully. We avoid talking about death as if it's something terrible. But the elderly are not afraid of death if they feel they've lived enough. Fear only shows up when things are left undone, when regrets remain, when apologies haven't been made, when we haven't said "I love you," or even just "I'm okay." I'll always remember Mrs. Cecilia, 93 years old, who prepared for death the way one might prepare for a long journey. She wrote letters by hand to every loved one. She cleaned her room. She picked out the music she wanted to play. But most strikingly, she recorded a video looking straight into the camera and saying, "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. But don't cry for too long, okay? I've lived enough. I've laughed enough. I've loved enough. And I've forgiven everything." Her entire family watched that video and wept. But then they laughed because in the video she wore a giant Christmas hat, swaying to music, smiling like a child. She didn't die in fear. She left in joy. I've learned this death is unavoidable, but we can choose how we welcome it. And the elderly need space to talk about it openly, lovingly, without false promises or pretending to stay young forever. They need help preparing mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. They need to be heard about how they want to say goodbye, and they need to live fully so that when the time comes, there is no regret. I've learned this death is unavoidable, but we can choose how we welcome it. And the elderly need space to talk about it openly, lovingly, without false promises or pretending to stay young forever. They need help preparing mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. They need to be heard about how they want to say goodbye. And they need to live fully so that when the time comes, there is no regret. There is something I realized after hundreds of conversations and thousands of hours of listening. It's not aging that weakens people, it's how they are treated that breaks them. An old man once said to me, "I'm not afraid of growing old. I'm afraid of being seen as obsolete." That sentence stayed with me not because it was new, but because it was true. We live in a society that glorifies the new phones, new cars, new homes, new people. But we quietly forget the value of what is old, weathered, and still standing strong. Like the wrinkles on a grandmother's face who raised 3 generations with her bare hands. Like the thin, tired hands that still fold blankets for her grandchildren. like fading memories that still fight to stay alive. And because they're seen as past their prime, many older adults no longer voice their fears. They hide them, not wanting to worry their children. They stay silent, not wanting to be a burden. They smile when in pain and say, "I'm fine," when they're hurting inside. But behind their eyes lies an ocean of unspoken thoughts. And if no one listens, that ocean will quietly rise and drown everything. I remember once sitting next to a woman named Martha, 86 years old, who had never left the town where she was born. She told me she sits by the window each morning not to enjoy the breeze, but to see that others are still alive. It was such a simple sentence, but it left me speechless. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She didn't expect anything. She just wanted to see people walk by. Because for her, that too was connection. I asked if anyone visited her often. She smiled sometimes. But don't blame the kids, they're busy living. I kept thinking about that phrase, busy living. It's so real. We're all busy living, busy earning money, busy paying bills, busy studying, busy raising children. And in that whirlwind, we assume our parents and grandparents are doing fine because they rarely complain. But the truth is, the older they get, the less they complain. Not because they feel less pain, but because they've learned to endure it. And if no one knocks on their door, they'll sit quietly and silent, and with their silent worries rising like tidewater each day. One of the scariest feelings is the sense of slowly disappearing from the world, not physically, but in presence. When no one asks for your opinion anymore. When no one invites you into the conversation. When everything happens too fast, too digital, too modern, and you feel like someone standing outside a machine that's speeding ahead. You no longer understand the latest apps. You fumble at the ATM. You sit quietly at family gatherings as people talk about TikTok, AI, cryptocurrency, supply chains, and you just nod, pretending to follow. I once saw a grandfather get scolded by his granddaughter for asking 3 times how to open Zalo. The girl sighed, "Grandpa, I'm really busy and you keep asking." He quietly folded the phone and whispered, "It's okay. I don't need it anymore." That sentence seemed gentle, but it carried a wound no apology could heal. It was the wound of being excluded. And for the elderly, being excluded from the world is a slow kind of death. But there are those who don't accept that fate. They learn, they try, they ask without hesitation. Mrs. Eleanor, 90 years old, started her own YouTube channel to teach cooking. Each of her videos gets just a few hundred views, but she says, "I've never felt more alive than I do now." The image of her in a mesh cap, hands trembling as she slices onions, speaking into the camera with a sincerity so pure you can't help but love her, is living proof that aging doesn't have to be about waiting for the end. It can be a brand new beginning if we allow ourselves to begin again. I believe everyone has the right to live fully until the very last moment. Not just exist, but live, with purpose, with joy, with connection, with laughter, and with tears. And if society doesn't create that space, then we, the younger ones, must. One phone call a week, one shared meal a month, one hug when passing by, one heartfelt thank you when receiving a bowl of soup your mother made. These gestures are small, but to the elderly they are nothing short of magic. Living is not just for the young, and aging is not life's afterthought. It is the final chapter, and if we write it well, it can be the most beautiful one of all. An old man once told me old age is not the winter of life. It's the autumn, vivid, warm, sometimes chilly, but if you know how to live it, it's beautifully melancholic and deeply meaningful. I've never forgotten that line. And since hearing it, I no longer see the elderly as worn-out shadows. I see them as rare, treasured books, not glossy or new, but filled with lines written from a whole life. We're living in an increasingly youth-obsessed world where 25-year-olds worry they're too late. 30-year-olds fear they're falling behind, and 50-year-olds are considered past their prime. In this whirlwind, the elderly are pushed to the sidelines. But if we just stop for a moment, read a page from their lives, listen to a chapter from their memories, we'll understand there is nothing more valuable than an elder who still has something to share. I once interviewed a 94-year-old woman named Grace who raised 4 children, worked as a seamstress, and never traveled more than 200 kilometers from where she was born. I asked, "What do you think is the biggest regret among the elderly?" She didn't hesitate. No one asks them what they know. That answer sounded simple, but it cut sharp like a blade. So much knowledge, so much experience, so many life stories locked away inside the elderly simply because no one thinks to ask. I once heard Mr. David recall how when he was young he made a major financial mistake that caused his family to lose everything. He spent 15 years repaying debt, working 2 jobs, enduring guilt. And now when he's finally ready to share that lesson, no one asks. "They think I don't understand the modern world," he said. But a mistake is a mistake, it doesn't expire. I believe he's right. The pain of aging is not just in being forgotten, it's in feeling useless in a world they once helped build. I believe he's right. The pain of aging is not just in being forgotten, it's in feeling useless in a world they once helped build. We often think that helping the elderly means buying medicine, driving them to the doctor, or installing grab bars in the bathroom. But the greatest help is making them feel that they still matter. It's calling them not because you need something, but simply because you miss them. It's asking them what they think, not just telling them what you've done. It's letting them teach you a recipe, a lesson, a life story. Elders don't need your seat, they need your attention. Just once to know they're still important. And when they feel they matter, they stop fearing old age. They see it not as an ending, but as a different kind of beginning. I've seen a woman start learning photography at 81. A man begin playing guitar at 86. A grandmother take up meditation at 89. And they all told me the same thing: I wish I'd started earlier. Not to be great, just to know that they still could. Aging doesn't take away your ability. It simply asks you to do everything more patiently, more slowly, and with more love. And if you're reading this, if you're breathing, thinking, listening, then you're still alive. And being alive means you still can. I once saw a grandfather rewriting his journal from when he was 20 to give to his grandson. Each page held a memory: his first love, his first time unemployed, the first loss of someone close. To him, those stories were the most valuable gift he could leave behind. Not a house, not a savings account, but his life captured in ink. And I believe that if every elderly person knew they could leave behind something, just a story, a laugh, a memory, they'd no longer see the end of life as meaningless. They'd see that even slow, even worn, even weak, they're still part of the bigger picture. We don't get to choose how we're born, but we can choose how we grow old. And if you have that choice, I hope you choose to age beautifully. Not in the way society defines beauty, but in a way that makes you proud. That you lived, that you loved, that you forgave, that you learned, that you shared, and that you have no regrets. When I started interviewing elders for this project, I always asked one simple question. If you could go back in time and tell your younger self one thing, what would it be? And you know what? Nearly 90% of them said some version of the same 2 words: live more. No one said work more, save more, or be more careful. Almost all of them said, I wish I had lived more truthfully, dared more, loved more, laughed more, made more mistakes. But honestly, old age is the place where you can no longer hide from yourself. You have to sit face to face with everything you've done and everything you were too afraid to do. I still remember a man named Frank, 91 years old, a retired mechanic. He said, I never went far from this town. Not because I didn't have the chance, but because I kept postponing it. I thought maybe when I have more time. But when I finally did, I didn't have the strength. Then he looked at me, eyes full of tears, and said, Don't wait until you have enough, because it's never enough. I wrote that down, and I read it every time I feel like putting something off. I wrote that down, and I read it every time I feel like putting something off. There's a painful truth: many people only begin to live authentically when they realize they're about to die. They finally say "I love you" after the person has already left. They finally travel when their heart is too weak. They finally learn to dance when their knees begin to ache. They finally apologize when the other person is no longer lucid enough to understand. But some people still find the courage to do it, and I call them warriors of the sunset. So, I once met a woman named Hilda, 88 years old, who wrote a handwritten letter of apology to her sister after 40 years of silence. They had fought over a small inheritance issue, but she said, "I don't want to carry anger to the grave." They hugged in a hospital room, tears soaking their face masks, and Hilda said, "I felt like I came back to life." Forgiveness doesn't just free the forgiven, it saves the one who forgives. I also met a man named Roger who decided to propose to his teenage sweetheart at the age of 87. They had been in love at 17, but life took them in different directions. They met again at an old class reunion. Roger told me, "I thought if I don't do it now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." And I was right. They got married in a backyard with handmade garlands, surrounded by their 8 grandchildren acting as bridesmaids and groomsmen. A true, simple, and timely love, because yes, it's never too late to begin again. And I want you, if you're reading, watching, or listening, to pause for just a moment. Think about something you've always wanted to do but kept putting off. Make that phone call. Write that letter, buy the ticket, say "I'm sorry," say "thank you," say "I miss you." Start learning something new, start forgiving, start letting go, start living truthfully. Because later in life you'll realize the greatest pain isn't what you did wrong. It's what you never dared to do. I once heard a woman named Lucille, 95 years old, say, "Death is a guest who will certainly come. But when he arrives, I want to be in a pretty dress, wearing red lipstick, reading a book and smiling." That image brought tears to my eyes, not because it was sad, but because it was full of hope, full of life, full of choice. And I want you to know, if you're 60, 70, 80, even 90, you still have a choice. Not to choose everything, but to choose how you live the rest of your life. No one can take that from you unless you give it away. Older people don't need pity, they need respect. Not because they're old, but because they are vaults of memory, wisdom, and stories that younger generations can't understand unless we sit down and truly listen. And if you're still young, don't wait until you're old to start living authentically. Don't wait until your hair turns gray to think about forgiveness. Don't wait for illness to come knocking to start loving. And never assume you have plenty of time. Time never announces when it's about to run out. Time never announces when it's about to run out. I've sat beside many people in their final days. Some whispered with fragile breath, "I wish I had lived differently." Others stayed silent, but their eyes held 1,000 things left unsaid. One woman named Martha looked at me for a long time and said, "If you had met me 30 years ago, I might have lived differently. But it's okay, because meeting you today changed me a little." That sentence has never left me, because it showed me something profound. Elderly people don't need us to change their whole life. Sometimes just one sincere moment of listening is enough to make them feel that they still matter. There's one fear that many elders have confessed to me but often keep buried deep: the fear of being forgotten. Not while they're alive, but after they're gone. That no one will tell their story. That no one will remember their birthday a year after they've passed. That no one will recall the way they made coffee, or how they hummed yesterday each morning, or the funny voice they used to tell bedtime stories. I once asked Mr. Samuel, a war veteran, what he feared most. He looked at me and said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid no one will remember I ever existed." It broke my heart. A man who once held a gun to defend his country, who had a loving wife and kind children, who wrote poems and played chess every afternoon, now fears being erased. We never think about this when we're young, but one day when you're 80, 85, 90, you'll sit in front of a mirror and wonder, when I'm gone, will anyone still say my name with warmth? And if the answer is no, it's not because you weren't worthy. It's because no one was taught how to remember you. That's why I believe every elderly person should tell their story. It doesn't need to be beautiful. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real. Record it, write it down, film it, tell it to your grandchildren. Start a podcast if you like. Send a letter, make a photo journal, preserve whatever you can. Because one day when you're no longer here, those little things will be what others hold on to. Not your property, not your achievements, but the memories that only you could tell. I know a woman named Phuong, a Vietnamese grandmother living in the US, who hand-wrote 100 to 200 pages of memoir chronicling her life. From fleeing war to settling down to working as a seamstress, raising 4 kids, every surgery she had, every love letter from her husband. She wasn't a writer, but that's the most precious book I've ever read. Because it's honest, it's alive, it's her. If you're young, ask your parents or grandparents, what was your first love like? You might be surprised. And if you're old, don't be afraid to share. Maybe the kids are busy. Maybe they won't listen right away. But just plant the seed. One day when they're ready, they'll come back to find it. There's one more thing I want to share, not one of the 5 main fears, but something that drifts like a thin fog through the minds of many elders. The fear of becoming invisible. No one sees you anymore. No one needs your opinion. No one waits for you at dinner. No one texts, "How are you feeling today?" No one notices when you're gone. No one truly knows when you've disappeared. A woman once told me I used to be the center of my whole family. Every party, every plan, every little thing went through me. Then one day I just faded. The party still happens, but no one asks what I'll wear, where I'll sit, what I'd like to eat, what happened. I didn't have an answer, because I had done the same with my own grandmother. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. I'm writing it to remind you a simple message. A short call, a passing question, a look filled with care. All of these things, when added up, can rescue a soul that's slowly fading at the end of its journey. Old age doesn't need fireworks. It just needs small rays of sunshine, steady, genuine, and from the heart. If you've ever walked into a nursing home at dusk, you'll feel something deeply present waiting. It's not loud, not urgent, but it fills the air, waiting for a phone call, a doorbell, a kind word from a passing nurse, waiting for someone's eyes to linger just 1 second longer. Waiting for something, anything to happen just so today feels different from yesterday. Waiting for a phone call, a doorbell, a kind word from a passing nurse, waiting for someone's eyes to linger just 1 second longer. Waiting for something, anything to happen just so today feels different from yesterday. I once visited a nursing home on a Saturday afternoon. The sky was clear, the breeze was soft, and red leaves had gathered across the tiled hallway. In the common room, 7 elderly residents sat together. No one spoke. Each one stared in a different direction, but I knew they were all looking at the same place, the place no one comes from. When I asked Mr. Edward what he hoped for most during the week, he didn't hesitate. For someone to say my name. Not to bring gifts, not to give money, just to call his name with a familiar voice. Because he said when you hear your name from someone's lips, you know you still exist. That moment made me realize a person's name, when forgotten, is like the final nail in the door of existence. Older people don't want to be a bother, but that doesn't mean they don't hope. They've learned to be silent not because they have nothing to say, but because they've grown used to not being heard. They don't text first, they don't call often, they don't complain. But that doesn't mean they don't need your presence. It just means they're afraid of being a burden, afraid of tiring you out. There was a woman named Lee, a literature teacher who taught for 40 years. When I asked her what she remembered most from her teaching career, she said, "It was when a student mentioned my name in their thesis acknowledgments." I asked, "Do you still keep in touch with them?" She smiled. No one remembers their old teacher once they're successful, but then she proceeded to tell me the names of former students, their personalities and stories that once made her laugh or cry. That memory had not faded. But it was one way it went out and never came back. I believe a kind society is one that does not forget its elders. A society that cares not only for their health, but for their dignity, their memories, and the values that may seem small but form the foundation of a generation. There was a man named Gregory. He used to be a bridge engineer. When I visited him, he led me to the balcony and pointed into the distance. "That bridge over there, I designed it." His eyes lit up like a child showing off a toy. But then he whispered, "No one knows that now. People cross it every day and don't know my name. That's okay. But when I'm gone, the bridge will still be there. And that's the one thing that makes me feel like I've left something behind. I wish every elder could have a bridge like that, something that reminds them they lived with purpose. A photo, a book, a thank you, a beautiful memory someone will pass down. And I want you, if you still have parents or grandparents, to find their bridge and show them we see it. We remember. And we're grateful. Because when people know they'll be remembered, they live the rest of their days with more peace, less fear, and lighter hearts. I once saw a man pass away in his sleep, peaceful without pain. But what stayed with me most was this: when they opened his wallet, there was a small handwritten note. It read, "My dear son, if one day I'm gone, please don't be angry. I was once a son too, and I learned how to be a father just as you're learning to be a man." The paper had turned yellow, but I believe the love in those words never faded. The paper had turned yellow, but I believe the love in those words never faded. We often forget that the elderly were once young. They too once loved wildly, rebelled boldly, made foolish mistakes, and dreamed recklessly. They wrote love letters, got scolded, felt regret, cried over movies, and sat alone in cafes pondering the future. They are not just people who need prescriptions and doctor appointments. They are novels unread and full of wonder. And if we're willing to sit down and turn the pages, we'll see ourselves inside. The things we haven't yet understood, the mistakes we're still repeating, the lessons we've yet to learn, the values we're close to losing if we don't protect them. I once witnessed an elderly woman carefully sorting through old photos, birthday cards, and handwritten notes from loved ones. Each tiny item might seem meaningless to others, but to her it was an entire lifetime. When I asked, "Why do you keep all this when everything's on a phone now?" she simply looked at me and replied with a sentence I'll never forget. "A phone doesn't have the smell of old ink, the fingerprint of someone gone, or the fold made by the trembling hands of a husband long ago." I fell silent. We often confuse saving with remembering. Your phone may hold hundreds more photos than a dusty album, but it can never replace the one faded, torn picture you touched, laughed with, and cried beside. The elderly understand this better than anyone. To them, memories aren't stories, they're anchors, something to hold on to when everything else is slipping away. I once spoke with Mr. George, a retired photographer. When his hands became too shaky to hold a camera, he began redrawing his favorite photos from memory, one a day. Not perfect, not even precise, but real. He called it drawing memories so they won't blur. Each time he gave one to his grandson, he said, "When I'm gone, you'll still remember this face." That 7-year-old boy now keeps them in a small wooden box like treasure. From Mr. George, I learned that elders don't need statues in their honor. They just need a small place in the memories of those they love. A place where once a year someone pauses and smiles and thinks, "That's how Grandpa used to be." That alone makes a life feel lived. Do you know one of the greatest sadnesses of old age? It's the feeling of no longer belonging. Not because they haven't tried, but because the world moves too fast and no one waits. New language, new tech, new habits, new values. The things they protected and believed in are now called outdated. And slowly they shrink their world into something smaller, familiar, slower, and warmer. There's a man named Malik, once a high school literature teacher who could recite hundreds of classical poems by heart. But now his grandson says, "That old poetry stuff is so cheesy, Grandpa." Malik doesn't get upset. He simply folds his notebook and says, "Maybe I really am old now." But I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet loneliness. Not because his grandson was wrong, but because the gap between them was larger than words. As young people, we don't need to pretend to love the past, but we can at least listen with respect. No one's asking you to memorize old poems, but if someone reads one to you, don't interrupt. Don't laugh. Don't make them feel like they're the last person still speaking a language from another time. Don't make them feel like they're the last person still speaking a language from another time. More than anyone, the elderly understand what it means to endure time. They've lived through war, natural disasters, and profound loss. They lived without phones, air conditioning, or insurance. And yet they still grew up, built families, and held on to the most essential values: morality, kindness, patience, and gratitude qualities. The modern world is slowly trading away for convenience. I'm not saying everything old is right, but some things are absolutely worth remembering, not to live in the past, but to let the past guide the present. And the elderly are our living maps, if only we'd take the time to open and read them. I once asked a woman named Teresa, "Do you have any advice for young people?" She didn't say anything profound, she just looked at me and said, "Don't think your parents are immortal." That sentence struck like lightning. Because it's true. When we're young, we assume our loved ones will always be there, always answering our calls, always cooking our favorite meals, always sitting on that familiar porch chair. But one day you look and the chair is empty, and nothing can ever truly fill that space again. If you still have parents or grandparents, ask them about their life stories. Ask now. Don't wait. Ask who they once loved, what they once dreamed, what they regret, what brought them the most joy, what made them feel most alone. And listen with your whole heart. Don't interrupt. Don't Google halfway through. Don't scroll while they speak. Listen as if you're collecting a treasure that might soon disappear. One October afternoon, I sat with Mr. Min, 87, originally from Hugh, now living in California. We talked about war, about famine, about the days he biked for miles just to deliver a love letter to the woman who would become his wife. Then suddenly he turned to me and asked, "Have you ever thought about how you'll leave this world?" I hadn't. But he had. He said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to die in silence." I asked, "What do you mean?" He replied, "I don't want to go without leaving something behind. Even if it's just a small story, a sentence that makes someone laugh, a recipe no one else can cook like I do. Or even a lesson from a mistake I made." He sat there gently brushing his hat, eyes gazing at the maple trees turning red. "I think everyone fears being forgotten, especially if you were once the center of a whole family." That moment stayed with me, because it wasn't just true for Mr. Min, it was true for almost every elder I've ever met. They don't need to be praised, they don't need biographies, they just hope that one day someone will smile and remember them with warmth. My grandfather used to wink every time he lied. It was hilarious. My grandmother made a sour soup no one else could ever replicate. My dad told the same story 10 times, but every time it made me cry. These are the things that keep the departed alive in those who remain. And I realized most elders don't need you to give them anything big, they just need you to take something from them so they know they've left something behind. That's what makes death feel less like an end and more like a quiet continuation. I once sat with a woman named Anne, 92 years old. She'd never used social media, never left her home state. She told me, "These days people want to leave their mark online, likes, shares, views. But all I want is for my granddaughter to remember that I used to sing her 'You Are My Sunshine,' and that I loved her even if I can't remember her name anymore." I was speechless, because what could be more beautiful than a love that outlives memory? Don't wait until your loved one is in a hospital bed to ask how they want to be remembered. Don't wait until the funeral to talk about the beautiful things they once did. Don't wait until there's no reply to finally call their name. Because when that time comes, you'll wish you could go back. And no one can give that time back to you. Death, if we really look at it, isn't as scary as we think. What's scary is dying before we've truly lived, before we've loved fully, before we've forgiven completely. But if we live each day as if it might be our last time doing something, then we'll live deeper, more honestly, more fully. And when death does arrive, we'll be ready to greet it with a smile. And when death does arrive, we'll be ready to greet it with a smile. I once met Mrs. Hang, 89 years old, a Vietnamese woman living in Texas, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by tubes. But she still smiled and said, "I'm not afraid of dying, dear. I just hope I don't leave behind regret for those I love." I asked, "How do you know for sure?" She replied, "Because I've said sorry to those I've hurt. I've said I love you to everyone I care about. And I've lived not perfectly but fully. That to me was the most beautiful goodbye I've ever heard. If you still have time, still have strength, still have the chance, please don't wait until you're lying down to start organizing your memories. Live now as if each word, each look, each action were part of the will you'll leave behind. Because sometimes what stays the longest is not what we owned, but how we made others feel. People may forget what you did for a living, but they will never forget how you made them feel. One Saturday afternoon, I visited Mr. Robert, 90 years old, a former wooden boat builder. His small home smelled of pine resin, wood shavings, and old hardcover books. He had severe arthritis and could barely move. But each day he continued sanding small wooden pieces to build a miniature boat for his grandson. "He doesn't care much for these boats," he chuckled. "He loves his phone. But I keep building because I want him to have something he can touch, not just something he can swipe away." I'll never forget that phrase, something you can swipe away. Our world moves too fast, consuming everything with the flick of a screen. But to the elderly, every moment is something to be held, cherished, and offered with sincerity, not because they're slow, but because they know time is too precious to waste on the superficial. I asked Mr. Robert what he hoped his grandson would remember. He said just that an old man once spent all summer building a tiny boat for him, and that he loved him in the way my generation shows love, quietly, slowly, but sincerely. There's something elders do better than most young people, loving without needing anything in return. Loving in sunde. Loving through actions, not words. I once met Mrs. Josephine, who baked cookies every week, labeled them with her grandchildren's names, and asked neighbors to deliver them because she couldn't drive anymore. I asked, "Why don't you just call them to pick them up?" She smiled, "Because I want them to receive something they didn't have to earn, just to know that love doesn't have to come with conditions." I cried when I heard that. Because while many people demand to be loved the right way, elders often just hope to be loved despite no longer being able to give much. We, the generation racing against time, can learn so much from this quiet wisdom. That love isn't about intensity, it's about consistency. It's in the little things done over and over year after year. A glass of water at the perfect temperature, a neatly folded towel, a shirt mended instead of discarded. These are how the elderly say I care. And I've realized the elders I've met don't expect repayment or full understanding. They just want acknowledgement, to be seen, to be recognized as still trying, still capable of love, still deeply deserving of being loved in return. Elders don't hope for the extraordinary. They hope for companionship, someone to sit beside them patiently listening to a story they've told 10 times. Someone to hold their hand while walking without rushing. Someone to send a handwritten card instead of a template message. Someone who remembers them on an ordinary day, not because it's a birthday, not because it's a holiday, but simply because they're remembered. If you live with aging parents, grandparents, or simply know someone who's growing older, please do something specific today. Call them, sit beside them. Say, I want to hear your story. Grandma, will you teach me that recipe? Dad, I still remember how you drove me to school every morning. Mom, I know you always save me a plate even when I come home late. Those little sentences might be what they replay in their minds for the rest of the week, or maybe for the rest of their life. I once witnessed a grandfather on his deathbed smile as his son whispered, I love you, Dad. His eyes were closed. The monitor beeped steadily. But one tear rolled down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain. It was the tear of someone who knew he was loved at the very moment he needed it most. It wasn't a tear of pain. It was the tear of someone who knew he was loved at the very moment he needed it most. There's one thing I always carry with me after leaving a nursing home: the silence. Not peaceful silence, but a silence filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions that never had the chance to be voiced. These places aren't short on light or food or medicine, but they often lack the most precious thing: the feeling of being seen, acknowledged, and vividly present in someone's life. Once I asked Mrs. Elaine, 88 years old, "What do you look forward to most each day?" She didn't hesitate, someone calling my name with a familiar voice. That simple answer struck me deeply because it was so real. A woman who had been a mother, a wife, a sister, a caretaker, now only wished for a name to be spoken with affection, just to know she still existed. We often think love has to be big: a house, a car, covering medical bills. But to the elderly, love can be a gentle tap on the shoulder, an unrushed gaze, a message with no typos, a name spoken without a sigh. I once sat listening to Mr. Henry talk for 45 minutes about his first bicycle in 1952. I didn't interrupt. I didn't press with questions. I just nodded, smiled, and occasionally asked a bit more. When he finished, he held my hand and said, "It's been a long time since anyone let me finish a whole story." And I cried. Because I realized, like so many others, that listening is the purest form of love, and it doesn't cost a thing. We live too fast, each day packed with to-dos, endless calls, deadlines piling up. We say we're busy like it's a shield to hide behind, avoiding things that would take only a few minutes. We delay calling our parents because there's always tomorrow. We read their texts but don't reply. We assume they understand, they're used to it, but in truth it hurts them deeply. Mrs. Rosa, 91, once said, "I'm not angry with my children or grandchildren. I just wonder if I disappeared one day, would anyone notice?" That question doesn't need an answer. It only needs someone to pause and ask themselves, have I loved enough? I remember asking Mr. Abraham what had made him happiest lately. He said, "When my grandson texted, 'Grandpa, I'll visit tomorrow.'" Just a message, but I read it over a dozen times. You see, what makes the elderly feel remembered, loved, and valued, it's not material. It's anticipation. a small signal that someone out there still thinks of them. I once asked a woman, "Are you afraid of dying?" She replied, "No, I'm just afraid of dying and no one noticing." That answer was a wake-up call. So many have passed silently, no tears, no send-off, no goodbye, because long before they died, they had already become invisible. That's why I wrote this script, to help younger people understand love doesn't have to wait for the right moment. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't need grand gestures. It just needs to happen right now while your heart is still beating and your loved ones are still here waiting for someone to say their name. And if you are someone growing old, I hope you know you are worthy of love, not for who you were, but simply because you are. You are living history, a witness to time, a keeper of memory, a symbol of resilience. And if you ever feel you have nothing left to give, remember your presence is a gift. Your presence is a gift. Rewrite your story. Say what you've always needed to say. Look your fears in the eye and then set them down. Forgive others and yourself. Call someone you've grown distant from. Share a lesson you've learned from a lifetime of living. Leave something behind in your name, a phrase, a dish, a smile, a piece of wisdom, a tender glance. Because this world needs you more than you think. I once asked an elderly woman, "Do you feel valued by society?" She looked at me and smiled sadly. Valued? Probably not. But if I'm not a burden, that's already a relief. Her words left me silent for a long time. Because it wasn't just her sentiment, it was the quiet truth shared by so many older adults. We celebrate youth, we honor energy, we glorify change. But we rarely look into faces etched with decades of wrinkles or hands thinned by time or steps that are slow but steady and say, "We're grateful that you're still here." And in that quiet neglect, elders learn to shrink. They stop telling stories thinking, "Who's listening anyway?" They stop offering advice afraid of being called old-fashioned. They stop sharing because no one waits long enough to hear the whole sentence. But that doesn't mean they have nothing left to say. In fact, those who have lived nearly a full lifetime are the ones with the most to teach. Because they don't speak from theory but from experience, not from textbooks but from blood and tears and sleepless nights spent worrying over children and grandchildren. They don't preach kindness, they've lived it quietly. They don't lecture about morals, they embody them often in a soft glance, a nod of understanding, or a sacrifice they never mention. There was a man named Paul whom I deeply admire. He was a simple laborer, no title, no wealth, no fame, but for years he quietly paid for the education of 3 orphaned neighbor children. No one knew until he passed away, and those children, now engineers, doctors, and teachers, came to his funeral weeping like his own. Paul never asked for praise, he simply lived by what he believed was right, and that was enough. The elderly don't expect grand gestures, they just hope you don't forget they still exist. Don't forget to ask, "Did you sleep well?" Don't forget to offer your seat not for politeness but for compassion. Don't forget to invite Grandpa to the gathering, even if he only sits and listens. Don't forget to let your mother finish the story she's already told 10 times. Don't forget, because forgetting can kill a living person faster than any illness. Don't forget, because forgetting can kill a living person faster than any illness. I once saw an elderly woman bring her coat out to the porch every afternoon, rain or shine, just in case my granddaughter stops by. She didn't come, but the woman waited anyway. Not because of hope, but because love for the elderly doesn't need a reason. It just needs somewhere to go. That love isn't flashy, it isn't loud, but it's persistent, it's steady. It's the kind that warms your heart just by remembering the smell of your mother's soup, the soft shuffle of your grandmother's slippers, or the calloused hand of your father on your shoulder when you were down. Do you know what brings elders the most joy? Not expensive gifts, not total rest, not being praised, but simply being included, being present, being part of their children and grandchildren's lives, even in the smallest ways. A thoughtful question, a shared photo, a homemade treat, or an invitation to a birthday party, even if they leave early. Old age is not the time to be put away. It's the time to be embraced with the full gratitude of the generations that followed. And if you are growing old, please remember, you don't have to earn love. You don't need to be strong all the time. You don't need to be an example. You don't need to fake a smile. You just need to be yourself, and that is enough. Mrs. Madeline once told me aging is like walking through an autumn forest. Everything is beautiful, but you know you're nearing the edge of the woods. I asked, "Are you afraid?" She shook her head. "No, as long as I'm not walking alone. I don't need a crowd. One person is enough." That stayed with me. Stayed. Because perhaps what elders fear most isn't death, but reaching the end alone. No hand to hold, no one to see them, no one to hear their last words, no one to remember their final steps. And the saddest part, that doesn't have to happen. No one should leave this world in solitude. No one should walk to the final stretch of life without a farewell. Without someone stopping, without someone saying thank you for living. If you have an elderly loved one nearing their final years, be their companion in the autumn forest. You don't need to say much. You don't need to do much. Just be there. Be present. Listen. Nod. Smile. Cry. Be silent. Hold their hand. That alone is a miracle. I once witnessed one of the most beautiful scenes of my life. Mr. Harold, 93, was near the end. He could no longer speak, but his eyes were open. His daughter, nearly 60, leaned in and whispered, "I'm here. You can rest now. I remember everything you taught me, and I'll tell it to your grandchildren." A tear rolled down his cheek, and I knew he passed in peace, because he knew he wouldn't be forgotten. We can't stop aging. We can't stop illness. We can't stop death. But we can make someone's final chapter warmer, fuller, more meaningful. And if you are the one aging, I hope you know you don't have to do it alone. Open your heart. Call an old friend. Write a letter to your child. Say the things you've held in for decades. Tell the old stories. Don't worry if you repeat them. Repetition is beautiful when it comes from an honest memory. Forgive because you deserve peace. Let go because you don't need to carry it all. Love again if your heart still stirs, and live not just because you're still breathing, but because you still want to. Forgive because you deserve peace. Let go because you don't need to carry it all. Love again if your heart still stirs, and live not just because you're still breathing, but because you still want to. I knew a woman named Elizabeth, 90 years old, who dressed up every morning, applied lipstick, and carefully brushed her hair, even if it was just to sit on the balcony. I asked, "Who are you getting dressed up for?" She smiled brightly. "For myself. I want to see a lady in the mirror even if she's almost 100. I had no words, only a smile. Because she taught me something no classroom ever could: dignity has no age. The beauty of aging doesn't lie in appearance. It lives in presence, in peace, in eyes that have seen everything, in hands that once held children, baked cakes, typed stories, and wiped away tears. That beauty doesn't need makeup. It comes from knowing you've lived honestly, fully, and deeply. And when you've lived like that, the end no longer feels like something to fear. Because you know you may leave, but you won't disappear. Your journey may end, but the path remains. You may no longer be present, but you will still be remembered through stories, through memories, through love. If you've stayed with me this far, if you've read, listened, and followed each breath, each slow step of these souls who have walked through the storms of life, then I only have one thing to say. Thank you. Thank you for giving your time to the elderly, not your own old age, but someone else's. Thank you for not scrolling past, not clicking away, not treating this as something sad or heavy. Because truthfully, old age is not sad. It is simply beautiful in a quieter way. Old age is the final chapter in a long novel, the pages that only true readers slow down to savor. The hurried ones close the book before they ever reach them. But if you are someone who wants to live deeply, kindly, and with responsibility for your life and the lives that came before you, then you're holding the right book, and you're reading the pages that someday, when you are the main character, you'll look back and say, "I'm glad I knew this earlier." You've learned about the fear of forgetting, so you'll start recording memories now. You've understood the pain of loneliness, so you'll reach out love first and stay connected. You've felt the fear of illness, so you'll care for your body and your mind. You've faced the ache of meaninglessness, so you'll live with intention even in the smallest things. And you've looked at death, so you can finally start to live. Because living isn't just working, eating, sleeping, and waiting for weekends. Living is letting your heart skip at birdsong. Living is tears falling at the sound of an old song. Living is calling someone's name with all the tenderness your voice can hold. Living is quietly holding someone's hand, saying nothing, because sometimes silence is the purest form of love. And if you are 60, 70, 80, there's nothing I can give you except this: you are still alive. And to be alive is to still have a chance to love again, to make things right, to write the next page, to forgive, to smile, to tell the story you've kept in your heart, to hold your grandchild tight and say, "I'm still here, and I love you," to look back at everything and not need to say a word, because you've lived. Let aging not be your retreat from life. Let it be your final performance, one that brings everyone to their feet when the curtain falls. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real, because you gave everything you had, because you touched someone just by living your truth. Let aging not be your retreat from life. Let it be your final performance, one that brings everyone to their feet when the curtain falls. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real, because you gave everything you had, because you touched someone just by living your truth. And if you want every remaining day of your life to be a day without regret, subscribe to the Life After 60 now. This is not just a YouTube channel. It's a shared home for seasoned souls and hearts learning to live slower, deeper, and truer. Here, every video is a story. Every voice is a hand reaching out to you. We don't teach you how to resist aging. We invite you to embrace it as one of the most beautiful phases of life. Share this video with someone you love. Send it to your mother. Send it to your grandparents. Send it to an old friend you haven't seen in years. Send it to your future self. Because old age is not the dusk of the day, it is the radiant sunset after a long, meaningful journey.